I do want to first of all start by introducing myself. My name is Nidhi, and I'm here at the faculty and I'm part of the Real Center, amongst other hats I wear. But very importantly, today I would like to first and foremost say a huge thank you to everyone who's been part of our learning journeys, not just as a center, but also at a very individual level for the last 10 years or more. And I just wanted to do a special shout out. It's not in any way exhaustive, but I do want to acknowledge Bela. You've been acknowledged quite a few times, which is just bad. Especially for Asar Pakistan, you were the first people who actually took on disability indicators into this Asar survey, which provided some really interesting reflections for learning outcomes and how they intersect and become even more worse for children with disabilities. A huge thank you to Monaza, Shanila, and hopefully many of the colleagues who will be joining us online, Rabia, Faisal Bari, Jolan Patel, and indeed from colleagues from Bahir Dhar in Ethiopia. I mean, just Laterite, Lydia, and the team, you guys have been absolutely phenomenal. And it would be completely amiss if I was not to thank all the PhDs and the postdocs who've been part of this journey for the last few years. So huge thanks to all of you. Anniversaries are also a wonderful time to just sit back and reflect on our own foundations. And I think I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the immense contribution of Professor Christopher Colclaw, he made in relation to specifically looking at disability in international education and development in our faculty and also beyond. We've come a long way since 2005 when Chris encouraged me to write first working paper on disability, youth and development for the then DFID. Believe me, there were no takers to read that paper. So today, I can say it's brilliant to see the number of SEDO colleagues and others who are really interested in engaging in this area. The scholarship has definitely grown within the faculty thanks to REAL, where we have now hosted 2 pre-global disability summits on education in 2018 under the aegis of REAL with the Impact Initiative, actually, and also last year in 2024 with CANDA, the Cambridge Network for Disability and Education Research. So hopefully, last few years have been a very exciting, significant, and significant is the word I'm looking for, and worthwhile journey, and looking forward to the next few years. So one thing I just want to lay out the field before we get into the details is that our starting point is that persons with disabilities, despite various global proclamations, continue to face persistent and often intersecting barriers to education, especially when disability overlaps with other factors of exclusion such as gender, race, geography, and poverty. And what's really, really centrally important, because you do usually get this in question and answers, so let me put it out there. It's not a homogenized construct, even though it is often spoken in very singular terms. And ultimately and fundamentally, inclusive education is an issue of social justice. And our work within CANDA and REAL over the last few years has been very much about looking beyond deconstructing the concept and construct of inclusive education, which is important. But really, our emphasis has been to critically engage in how to make equitable and inclusive education a reality in different contexts. And in doing so, what we also tend to do is draw on really different participatory, innovative methodological approaches, not surprisingly, because we want to be inclusive of voices. Okay? So that's the flavor of the kind of work we do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, unlike the previous panels, really we have been thinking about different questions to really illuminate the different experiences on this panel. So I'm going to start with Stephanie and invite you to reflect a little more on this how of inclusive education, which we tend to talk about a lot, by focusing on classroom practices, especially in under-recognized, under-resourced, marginalized contexts in South Africa. So what is it that led you to research these spaces, and what was your learning from that? So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Nidhi. I want to begin with a very simple provocation. If we want to understand how inclusive education happens in the Global South, we need to start by looking at what teachers are already doing, even if it means exploring spaces that are not prescribed by policy and government. So my research, embedded within the PEDAL and the REAL centers, was focused on a pedagogy for play, or pedagogy of play for autistic learners in South Africa, my home country. And it was really rooted in two guiding principles. First, that we must understand through rigorous research what is happening inside the classroom, so not just in policy contexts or documents. And second, that real inclusion and belonging cannot be theorized in abstraction. It must be lived, felt, and practiced. South Africa is finding itself at an interesting point in history. Last year marked 30 years since the start of democracy, and the country is emerging from an oppressive apartheid regime and has placed strong emphasis on inclusion and play as tools for educational transformation. And the introduction of many international promises was meant to catalyze a more just world for children with disabilities. And yet, despite these policy commitments, almost 90% of autistic children are educated in special schools, which is far from the vision of mainstream education. So what's more is the policies that do exist, they often overlook two crucial dimensions. So firstly, the geopolitical realities of South Africa, but also secondly, the neurodivergent needs of the learners themselves, specifically when it comes to playful learning. There has been a lot of deficit discourse around play and autistic learners. At the same time, the neurodiversity paradigm, and specifically in the global north, has done important work in centering autistic voices, but it too has largely ignored the intersectionality of disability, race, and geography. So I asked myself, where is the education of autistic learners actually happening in South Africa, and what can be learned from these spaces? I deliberately chose to work in these liminal transgressive spaces, so these special schools that are under-recognized and often led by Black communities. And these are not spaces that are celebrated in policy, but they are where the education is happening, and I would argue happening well. So while I do not advocate for nor against these transgressive liminal spaces, I do advocate what can be learned from them. These schools essentially reflect two key principles I believe are essential for understanding quality, disability, inclusive education. Firstly, understanding and harnessing what already exists, so the advocacy, the care, but also the continuous self-reflection of the teachers that are already underway in these communities. And secondly, taking a strength-based approach, so not starting from a lack, but starting from an expertise of those working in these school communities every day. I researched in 12 preschool classrooms across 3 very different public autism schools in low-income communities in South Africa over the course of 8 months. So this was very deep, participatory and exploratory work in close collaboration with South African organizations and strongly building on the knowledge of Black teachers and teaching assistants who emerged as the backbone of the education of autistic learners. And here's what emerged. For the teachers, education was not about charity, which is often assumed to be the case in discourses or discussions around disability. It was about preparing autistic learners for citizenship, for independence, and for employment. And their play pedagogy centered around 3 interconnected practices, which we've termed the 3E model. They are exploration, so making learning concrete, enjoyment, encouraging happiness, and empowerment, following children's interests. And all this was underpinned with efforts to create safe spaces for young learners, developing trusting bonds among teachers, students, and parents, and at the same time adhering to structured routines, which we know are key aspects for the needs of autistic learners.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that's really interesting because you highlight some really key points there around contextual sensitivity. But I was just also thinking, by positioning teachers as experts, what you're doing is what David mentioned, we're in the very first panel around treating teachers as professionals. And I think that's really useful, and thank you so much for that contribution. So I'm going to now move on to Sakina. Within the larger inclusive education debate, the focus tends to be very much on learners, the child in the classroom, where we've heard a lot of emphasis around that, but what we don't tend to talk much about is diversity within the teaching workforce itself. So, and I know your work is very much looking at teachers in London and highlighting some important issues around intersectionality, but also about how inclusive education is not simply something for the global south, but needs to be thought about deeply in the global north too. So would love to hear your thoughts, I'm sure, here.
Thank you, Nidhi. This is not an energizer, but I'm going to start off with a question. For those in the room or online, how many of us have been or were taught by teachers who self-identify with as a person of disabilities? Can we? All right, sounds about right. If we look around the room, there's not that many of us. Based on all the conversations that have happened since this morning and listening to the different panels and the speakers, I think it's really, really, really important to realize the importance of inclusion, not just in the global south. I personally don't like that term too much because I feel like it pushes a deficit narrative where the global south is the one in need and the global north is going to come and help and be their savior. And so I don't like it. Having said that, I think it's really important to focus on how the developed countries are struggling with inclusive classrooms and with classrooms that are equitable for everybody. So my research focuses on 17 teachers in London primary schools. They're all women, surprisingly. And it looks at their journeys in London primary schools, and I did interviews, I did a participatory approach, and the interesting thing that I found out when I started working with Nidhi was that even though in London 1 out of 5 people identifies as South Asian heritage, there's no research on South Asian heritage educators. So again, we find that huge vacuum of global South representation and teachers and studies and research on the global South heritage that exists within the global North. So in my research, I worked with, like I said, with 17 teachers, and 3 of them identified with having disabilities of different sorts. And today I'm going to focus on what I learned from those experiences, their struggles, their challenges. And I'm going to highlight 3 of the main things that emerge from the data. So the first one, and this sort of connects with what Bela said in the morning, was that thinking about the humanity of a teacher is really, really important. So when we think about South Asian heritage teachers, we have to think about their intersecting identities, be it race, gender, disability, and so many others. And the way that questions the way we think about inclusion today, and it challenges it. So one of my teachers, my study was qualitative, so which I'm very, very proud of. I have a lot of quotes to support what they said. And one of my teachers said, Sakina, I'm already a woman. You add Asian, you add Muslim, and then you add 2 disabilities. It's not a fair playing ground. And I feel like her experience sort of highlights the intersecting identities and how they come into play and magnify the feelings of exclusion and strain on teachers in London primary schools in 2025. And she was not alone. There were other teachers, who said things like, I look around the school and I'm not the norm. When I get emotional when I hear things like this because it sinks in very differently. When you look around the room and you see that you are not the norm, and then to articulate it to somebody else is a powerful thing in my opinion. And these experiences were not limited to just a teacher or 2 teachers. It was across the board. They all felt that their intersecting identities played a major part. And gender, whether we want to use language about, it's not about just the girls, or it should be about the boys, but I don't think that we need to be apologizing for saying that, no, gender is a huge, huge part of this. The second thing that came across was that visibility and representation matters. This is not a new thing, we all know. We all, talk about it all day long. But when these teachers talk about their own disabilities with their families, with their students, and with the other teachers, it breaks the norm of what is normal in our schools in London. So it talks about the notion of empathy and advocacy, which is a really, really powerful theme, which Nidhi, you've come across your work in the Southern context as well. And Sadia, not her real name, it's actually my sister's name, she said that, she completely understands why neurodivergent kids tend to struggle at school. It's loud, fast-paced, with so many distractions. We're doing maths for 30 minutes, never mind that you didn't fully process, and now we've moved on to science. You adjust, I get it. It's a lot for me as a teacher too, at times. Lived experiences like these prompted teachers to do things differently, as shown in another teacher's experience. I remember what it felt like for me. Nobody at school tried to understand the barriers to my learning. I don't want children to go through that. And using my background, I speak to them and their parents about my disabilities and showing that we can achieve. As disheartening as it was to hear their stories, and about their struggles and how they labeled it as a disaster, or it was a train wreck, or I was a mess during my school, it was very moving to see how these teachers translated their experiences into something positive to advocate for their students while also empowering the entire school community. The final insight that emerges from my work is that the education system is systematically failing teachers with disabilities, creating a social justice and equity issue that demands immediate attention. Teachers with disabilities described experiencing significantly greater workloads than their neurotypical peers. They spoke candidly about the daily challenges they face, like writing reports, talking to the principal, talking to the students, and self-monitoring consistently. All tasks that, due to their disabilities, require additional effort and energy. While some have channeled their creativity and abundance of energy into doing a PhD or taking their passion into leadership roles, others have felt let down by the systems that are meant to support them. All of these lived experiences kind of make me question, thinking about if inclusive education is our goal, then who gets to stay? Who gets the support, and who quietly gets pushed out? One of the teachers who resigned mid-year, and that's not an easy thing for a teacher to do, to quit her job in the middle of the school year, said, "There's no consideration that a teacher could also have some learning or other special needs. As a neurodivergent teacher, schools aren't inclusive for us. We bang on about being inclusive, but it's really hard to be inclusive when your own needs aren't being met. I enjoyed teaching. I was flourishing, but I flourished at a personal cost." As we reflect on these lived experiences of these teachers, and as they're managing their classrooms and navigating their intersecting identities, we're reminded that inclusion is not a checklist. It is not a policy, and it is not a one-size-fits-all. It is a lived daily practice that begins with seeing and supporting the whole person, teacher and student alike, no matter what their gender is. My son keeps saying, "Amma, why are you so obsessed with gender?" And I keep telling him that it's important. And it's important because there's work yet to be done. And it's been pointed out by panelists before that it's not done. And that's why we need to keep talking about it. And that's why words and language matters. So today I'll leave you with this. If we want to truly build inclusive schools, we must ask ourselves, who do we center, who do we silence, and who do we support? It's only when we start answering these questions honestly that real change can happen in any context, global north or the global south. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sakina. Sakina. I think you really do highlight some really key issues, and your work is actually adding to a huge body of research that you're building within Canada. We have the biggest data sets on teachers with disabilities working in mainstream settings. And actually, just to flag, with the Learning Generation Initiative funded by the What Works Hub, we'll be launching a big report on the 25th of June, which really provides a very strong research synthesis of the very small amount of research actually in this area, but a huge body of primary research that we've put together. So that's something to look forward to, and really hopefully use that as a strong advocacy element moving forward. So thank you so much to Sakina and Stephanie. Now moving on to my left here. So Mythili, over to you really, because teachers are key to inclusive education, okay? And but they also need to be very well trained. And your own experience and own work has been around teacher professional development and teacher training. So could you say more about what is it that you think from your experience, your work in different South Asian contexts, what is really central to making inclusion a reality in the teaching and learning lives of teachers?
Before I respond to your question, I would like to extend Sakina's experience to one of my own PhD students' work with life experiences of Dalit teachers. So Dalit are the most marginalized communities in India, and they have been historically discriminated against. There are policies, and the Constitution of India guarantees livelihood and a positive approach towards including them within the society. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. So while a lot of studies and literature exists around the experiences of Dalit students, both in schools and higher education, Dalit teachers' experiences have not been studied. And what my student found relates quite a lot to what Sakina shared about teachers with disabilities. So I want to argue here that it is equally important to bring in discrimination about teachers and the kinds of lived experiences that teachers from marginalized communities face within the education system before we begin to look at reforms in teacher education. So where teacher education is concerned, there is quite a lot of understanding about what is the curriculum needed, what is the pedagogy, what is the assessment that needs to be done for teachers to train them for social justice and inclusion. Globally, the teaching workforce is also becoming more and more diverse, but we have not been able to look at the needs of the diverse adult learners within the teacher education program. Some of what I'm going to say is going to be a repeat of the first panel, but nevertheless, I think it's important for this repetition as well. So, for example, the curriculum of teacher education programs that aim to prepare teachers for social justice and inclusion must, of course, have multiple perspectives to allow teachers to engage with the intersectionality of issues related to caste, gender, poverty, and geographic location, religious identities increasingly now in our country, and of course, class. Teacher educators have been told that critical pedagogy is essential to prepare effective teachers. Our National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education that was brought out in 2009 lays a lot of emphasis on critical pedagogy. And decolonial perspectives call for extending this criticality to the Eurocentricity of knowledge production as well. But then the current move of the Indian government to bring in a compulsory course on Indian knowledge system within teacher education programs is not the right direction to go in, simply because it is very reductive and one-sided. Now, all initial teacher education programs recognize the centrality of clinical practice, not just in India, but across South Asia. So in this context, there have also been efforts towards creating a third space. A third space is expected to bring in the expertise of teacher educators, teachers, school administrators, and the local community members. A comparative study of teacher education in Brazil, India, and South Africa that Professor Saeed and I have collaborated on points towards these curricular expectations along these directions. But state commitment in terms of implementation is very negligible. So states have now increasingly in South Asia and the larger globally as well, not just the global South, they've begun to look at teacher education as a policy problem. But then countries are not bringing in the required resources. At least in India, more than 92% of the teacher education providers are private players. So there is very little state investment in pre-service teacher education. And this is largely the case in many South Asian countries as well, other than Bhutan and Sri Lanka, where the state invests in teacher education. So basically, the point that I'm trying to make is that states can't abdicate their responsibility for teacher education, and the thinking that it can bring in tighter regulation to improve the quality of teachers is, we've seen that for the past 4 decades that it has just not worked in any country. So to sum up, one, we need more research in terms of the forms of marginalization that teachers face. And in this context, I must say that the pioneering research of Candor has been of immense help for both my students as well as me and a lot of us who are working on the diversity among teachers themselves. Secondly, we need affirmative policies that increase diversity among teachers. Strong redressal mechanisms are needed. And mid-level education functionaries and school leaders who are expected to provide support structures to teachers need to be oriented and sensitized to the needs of teachers from marginalized communities. So this came in very strongly from my students' research among the Dalit community. So teachers, the Dalit teachers ironically expressed that they gained recognition from within their own community, but they were disrespected among their peers and colleagues, and in some cases among students as well. And this, we have to realize, goes against the cultural trope of guru, as it is called in India, where teachers are highly respected traditionally. But the studies that have reported to this idea of guruhood to teachers have not included teachers from Dalit communities, obviously. So the teachers, the lived experiences of Dalit teachers point out the fact that redressal mechanisms are very important, and the need for sensitizing mid-level educational functionaries are equally important. Again, the reason being, so close to about 12% of teacher workforce. There are 9.2 million teachers in India, and 12% of them are from the Dalit community. But 3/4 of those teachers are in the state government schools. So 2 points emerge from this. One is that more number of male Dalit teachers are appointed in schools, which again goes against the trend of feminization in the school education workforce in India. So there is increasing feminization, especially in the primary years. So more number of Dalit men are entering schools, and they are placed in government schools. Private schools, which cater to 50% of the student population, have very little representation of Dalits. So that's why it is very important to bring in programs that sensitize mid-level functionaries towards the needs of Dalit teachers. a final point that I want to make is related to research. Although we have a very robust teacher education curriculum in the country, and the curriculum is unfortunately mandated, which again goes against the very principle of flexibility that is needed to make teacher education vibrant and locally relevant. So beyond this, how do we reach out to the needs of teachers? Is one, building capacities of teacher educators for more active and participative pedagogy that considers the diverse pedagogic needs of adult learners. And generally, studies have indicated that teacher educators are largely positively inclined towards inclusion, but they are not equipped to go beyond emotional support. So much as emotional support is required and essential, teacher educators also need a repertoire of pedagogic approaches to be able to meet the diverse learning needs of teachers. So one way of doing this is for teacher educators across global south to take charge of their own learning, generate good quality cases and narratives as part of their pedagogic repertoire, and set up vibrant learning communities to sustain and document inclusive practices, and also provide research-based support for informing policy, which is what the country is sorely lacking right now. Thank you, Nidhi.
Thank you so much, Mythili. Yeah. Sorry, technical issues first to be taken care of. Thank you. Here we go. So thank you so much for that, Mythili. I think you've raised some really important issues around teacher educators, and also opened up the debate, really, the discussions to what I'm hoping to go beyond teachers, so middle-level education functionaries, and I think that's a really important way of thinking about inclusive education, because again, the debates tend to be very much based on learner and teacher, but who are the other people who really need to be part of the discourse in a big way? And here I'm going to turn to Hanna, because a lot of the work that you're doing in the World Bank really takes a more systems-based approach and takes on a more, yes, teachers are important, but we also need to work with and in different countries. So not just beyond teachers, but also how does it look like between different countries? So over to you, reflections on your own learning and experiences.
Thanks very much, Nidhi. Hopefully the audio works. Yes? Okay. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I think it's wonderful to be able to be here in Cambridge. This university has really provided a lot of important forums for different purposes. Nidhi already mentioned the I'm going to call them pre-conferences. Hopefully they were pre-conferences of the 2 Global Disability Summits. And I think the last one here last year, September, was a very meaningful one, because it looked like the role of education was initially forgotten within the preparations. Maybe they were coming, but I thought it was very important to have it really lifted. And it's been great to understand also more about the work of the Real Center, the World Bank, where I work in the education global practice. The global department and the other regional departments have also used the work of Real Center a lot. And also now in recent years in my work, I've collaborated a lot, especially related to disability inclusion. I lead the inclusive education team. And it was really lovely to hear also here in this panel that this is what is, I think, extraordinary about this place. When we listen, Stephanie, and also all the other panelists here, the positionality of the researchers is unique here. So the way you are speaking about your researches, and I know maybe a little bit more about you than maybe all the audience, but I think that really speaks, and that's really powerful. And I think that's what's important when thinking of really looking at the systems as a whole. So the role of teachers that we've talked about here is very important, and the World Bank also has a very strong teacher program. At the moment, there is work coming out about initial teacher education. I think traditionally initial teacher education has been reflected on something that's difficult to change. Also, when looking at the results, you get more quicker results on professional development, continuous professional development as well. But it's been really important to actually look different systems and how they approach teacher education. But when we think of really strengthening systems in different parts of the world, it really has to be that systemic change. I think we've also heard here today about the importance of changing the social norms. And I wrote to myself, like, how do you actually do that in the context of disability inclusion? Because that is one of the questions that seems not to change. This year actually marks 10 years of when I completed my PhD. It also remarks 31 years when I started my master's studies. And when I was listening to you, and also when we worked for this presentation together, I almost felt like what you're working with is very similar to what I went through within my master studies. But really like thinking of diversity, inclusion, and equity, I think that is something that we need to be able to look in the communities, and also really thinking of what are those deeply rooted issues that are there and how to change them. Who are the main characters that matter? I did work 2 years in Solwezi. How many of you know where Solwezi is? No? Somebody? Yes, please. Sorry? Okay, it's not in Indonesia. That's always where I have been, but interesting to hear that there's another place. This one is in northwestern province of Zambia. And it actually has a specific characteristics because it has 3 different tribes living very closely with each other. So the way you approach anything, you really have to think through how to do it, how to involve all the different representatives of the community. So I think all of that is really important. I think learners with disabilities are still an afterthought. It's not there in the beginning where it should really be. And I think especially now at this time, not to forget the twin track approach, which really speaks for importance of really working with a focused approach. Is it scholarships for the learners with disabilities? Is it looking at teacher training, thinking of who are those professionals that are not there in the system, but also really thinking what do all the teachers need to know? It really would need to become everybody's business. I think that's something that I've heard more and more recently as well. How do we make this more of really everybody's responsibility? And what does it take to get there? And also getting that understanding that there are some general approaches that are probably important to share, and we can all remember those, but then there are those specific skills and knowledge where we need others, So I think in the World Bank context, those of you who maybe work with different country teams, we have the TTLs, which are like project leaders. So the best kind of TTL you can have in the World Bank context is the one who knows what he or she knows, and then what he or she does not know. And I think the best kind of leaders are this type of leaders, and we really need to do this more together. And really, what we've learned, it's very important to have this approach. Have also ministries of finance in different countries to understand it. Support governments, really ministries of education to have these discussions with Ministry of Finance. And it should really be on the table when thinking of any thematic areas. Is it early years? Is it data collection? Is it really when thinking of planning, learning, and learning management systems? Really professional development, leadership programs, just to mention a few. Really the whole system, any theme that we're working with. And it really should be part of the core. So not something that we can't deal with because there's so many other problems in any way. It is actually that inclusive approaches are the ones that will benefit everybody, and how to really make that concrete, I think, is important. We've had an agenda really referring on how the buildings are redesigned, how it is easier to design a building for everyone. And you know, that resonates in some contexts. I think what's important also to see that what are the other ways of really making sure that we understand that, you know, the time the babies are born, even the time the mother is expecting, there should be support systems in looking through what can be done if there is some evidence of anything that's a bit different. It's important to, and it's been said earlier, how important it is that context is recognized. So, it more or less, it is a context-specific process, and definitely not an expert from north to south or from west to east, as it's already been mentioned. But then it's really asking this question: what does this mean for the global guidance and country realities? And I think it's important, really, going back very briefly about thinking really those social norms and the role of communities. What are the historical and cultural elements that the countries have, and really going through them also themselves internally, but then also make sure that the external stakeholders understand that. And really, what does that mean? Because, if you want to make a change, you need to do it in partnerships, and those who come from external entities are really the ones who have to first listen and learn and understand what's going on. And I think those cultures of silence that were also mentioned in the panel earlier, it would be very important to be able to break them. So also when we're thinking of the World Bank staff, what we've done, we put together this kind of approach paper, just reminding about the 4 different principles that we'd recommend really for us all, to look at them together. So really thinking, where are the countries at? And then who are the people in different sectors who would need to collaborate? The multi-sectoral approach needs to be there. We also remind them to look at the school context, what was really presented here with the first and second speaker of the panel. What is the context of the teacher? Is the teacher alone? Who are the ones who can support? If there is cadre of professionals, that's a different scenario to the situation where there is none. And again, there are those examples of community volunteers who have been able to also step in and make it work. So I think it's important also to remember that the external funding is important, but we're really talking about empowerment and ownership, because that's the only way these things to actually stay. So we have to have disability inclusion in education part of the national budgets. And of course, the additional support is also definitely needed, but then it's also very critical for the ministries of education to remind about different stakeholders coming in, that we already have this part going on. Global Partnership is actually working in this big project right now, and the ones implementing are these folks, and this is what we've already done, but this is what's lacking. So that needs to be really important approach when looking at that. In the World Bank, what we've also tried to do is how to find these catalytic activities. There was Inclusive Education Initiative focusing on inclusive education, which was there for about 3 years, supported by the government of UK and Norway. And there was a lot of catalytic work that was done by this program. And for us also, how do we help the teams on the ground working with the lending operation to have incentives for the government in the form of grants is very critical in this area. It's still one of those emerging agendas, and once you have a grant, it really can make also the lending operations to learn and utilize that from there. So I think it's very important also from that perspective not to stop that. At the moment we have the Scottish Government who is working together with us and focusing on East Africa, and I will talk a little bit more later on about this Inclusive Education Policy Academy and Learning Exchange, which has been very fruitful experience, I think, also in many ways. And I think it's important for different stakeholders to acknowledge World Bank as one of those which is actually present in many countries. And I think, I always say to my colleagues, go and knock on people's doors, find the folks working for UNICEF, find the local researchers, and see what has already been done and how you can learn from that, and what to also work on within your own activities. So I think that type of approach is very, very important. So really looking at the whole learnings, that this change has to be systemic. It has to be planned in such a way that it'll be sustainable. Second, it really has to be context specific. So what does it mean in Haiti? It looks different in Indonesia or Zambia. And then thinking of the mainstream, especially at the moment, I think we've talked about, referred a little bit on foundational learning agenda here. How inclusive is that at this moment? How much do we recognize those with reading and writing difficulties around the world? Comorbidity of the learning, specific learning difficulties, it's not yet spoken. And what will help is share definitely more knowledge about that. How do we mainstream powerfully? I think is for us to really brainstorm together and find better ways to go forward. Please stop there.
Thank you so much, Hannah.